Hi everyone, this lecture is on American imperialism, the United States in the 1890s. Um, so let's talk about the origins of world imperialism. 1875 to about 1900 is called the Age of Imperialism, where rival empires were carving up the world amongst themselves. For example, in Europe, Belgium, Great Britain, France, and Germany had colonies in Africa, but they were also now starting to expand into Asia, the Middle East, and the Pacific. So there is a scramble for powerful countries to dominate Africa, Asia, and the Middle East during the Age of Imperialism. And the US at the time is a second rate power in the 1870s, even in the 1890s. And there's a sense that if the US is going to become powerful, like Great Britain, for instance, or France, then they too would have to participate in this scramble to gain more worldwide territories for themselves. So there's also a sense that these countries, these dominating countries, are bringing quote unquote civilization to the what they thought was the unenlightened world. They were going to bring modern technologies, modern sense of government to these places. By 1890, this is when we see a turning point in American foreign policy. America turns to be more focused on expanding outside of itself. The US becomes an imperial power by 1890. And we have a quote from the influential editor Henry Watterson at the time that says, quote, "We are a great imperial republic destined to exercise a controlling influence upon the actions of mankind and to affect the future of this world." End quote. So this is a pretty powerful sense of position that you can see many people feeling about the United States and its duty to the world. Expansion really had been limited to North America previously via the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine really was the only piece of foreign policy set by the US up to the 1890s, up until the 1890s. And you see a lot of Americans really starting to want to look abroad, not for territorial expansion, but to trade abroad because of the economic depressions that had been plaguing the US economy since the Civil War. There was an overproduction as a result of the Industrial Revolution, and the demand for consumer goods in the Far East drove this desire to expand. In 1893, American sugar planters overthrow the Queen in Hawaii, and Hawaii becomes a state that is annexed in 1898. It does not become an official U.S. state until 1959, however. In 1898, we also see the Spanish-American War begin, the splendid little war, as Secretary of State John Hay described it as, because it only lasted 4 months and resulted in 400 American casualties. So this war helped aid Cuban independence from Spain. It started as bringing aid to the Cubans and ended with the U.S. in a small possession of an overseas empire. All of these territories coming from Spain. The U.S. wins the war against Spain, and the U.S. Acquires the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. We also see in 1899 a Philippine-American War begin. The Filipinos had been fighting against Spanish control since 1896, led by Emilio Aguinaldo. But when President McKinley retained possession of the island, the Filipinos turned against the US. President McKinley at the time had said to the Americans that the US had a duty to, quote, the little brown brothers, end quote, to help modernize the country. Um, little brown brothers, this phrase just spews ethnocentrism and the paternalist viewpoint that many Americans had about the rest of the, quote unquote, non-European world at the time. The Filipinos eventually are able to get their independence in 1946, but the policies that American, had while they were still helping, or still in possession of the island, tended to serve only the local elites and left enduring poverty in the state. So in 1898, here is what the American empire looks like, right? We have obviously the United States, Puerto Rico, Alaska, which had been purchased from Russia in 1867, and then these Pacific islands, including the Philippines, Guam, and American Samoa. All right, the next section, growth of American nationalism. In the 1890s, we see a strong sense of patriotism growing after the Spanish-American War. Schools start saying the Pledge of Allegiance to start their day. The Star-Spangled Banner comes into existence. And the yellow press is really appealing to these patriotic sentiments. We also, for the first time, hear a sense of duty that Rudyard Kipling, the famous British poet, also author of The Jungle Book, as he coined in his poem, The White Man's Burden. And in it, he is calling upon the Anglo-Saxon race, essentially to help modernize, bring civilization, bring Christianity to the world. That it's essentially a race, and that if the white man doesn't participate in this race, then they will lose. But we also see that there's a growing sense of pro-expansion coming from Americans, right? Most of the pro-expansionists argued that America needed to look abroad, needed to grow its influence around the world, because one, there was a moral mission. In 1885, Josiah Strong published a book called Our Country. And in it, he says that commerce will follow the missionary. In other words, that the U.S. had a duty to spread Christianity, and commerce will follow. There will be strong economic incentives to go into these other countries and spread this Christian mission. We see evangelical Methodist Dwight Moody sending over 8,000 missionaries to quote unquote bring light to the heathen world, end quote, during this time. So there's definitely a moral mission. A second reason would be economic concerns. In 1893, there was a strong economic recession, a depression that left businessmen especially concerned about the overproduction and underconsumption in the country at the time. And if the American market can be grown overseas, then that would be a way to relieve some of these economic concerns. And the third reason that pro-expansionists argued for American expansion was for strategic protection. Alfred T. Mahan wrote The Influence of Sea Power, a book in 1890 that was essentially about Great Britain's naval history. And in it, he argues that great empire, what made Great Britain so powerful was that it had a strong navy. So Mahan believed that having strategic overseas bases in the Pacific would prove to be very important for protecting the U.S. and that in order to protect the U.S., we needed to have a strong, powerful navy. So what American expansion brought about was a debate amongst Americans. What would happen to the people of these territories, for instance, in Puerto Rico and Guam and the Philippines? Would they be citizens and eligible for all the rights that came with American citizenship, or would they be subjects and, like a monarchy, be subject to whatever the government and the president said to do? So, early entry into the ranks of imperial power sparked debate amongst Americans about the political democracy, race, and American citizenship. Drawing the global color line, American nationalism was reflective in a lot of ethnocentric laws that were quite evident at the time. For example, the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, that established separate but equal was constitutional, that it did not violate the 14th Amendment, and it was perfectly fine. So there's a lot of ethnocentric beliefs, and the laws are backing those beliefs up at the time. But there was also American debate over imperial expansion. We start to see some Americans speaking out against American imperialism, like the Anti-Imperialist League, that said, are we a republic or are we an empire? If we are a republic, we should not be going out and conquering others. That we have a duty to lead by example and help other countries to self-govern rather than govern them from abroad. So a lot of the anti-imperialist supporters were people who believed that the energies should be focused on domestic policies, focus on what's going on in the U.S. itself. Businessmen who were fearful of the cost of keeping overseas outposts, and blatantly people who were racist and did not want non-white populations to grow in the U.S. A lot of the proponents believed in a benevolent imperialism. Pro-expansionists believed that America was a quote-unquote benevolent empire, and they had the intention of uplifting backwards cultures and spreading liberty across the globe. In 1900, the presidential election was the Democratic elect William Jennings Bryan running against the Republican candidate President McKinley in 1900. And the most pressing question of this entire presidential race was, are we an empire or are we a republic? When Republican nominee McKinley won, and he was a strong proponent of American imperialism, I think that answered this political debate. So that is that.